So if you haven't already done so, go to the daily participation and click on resubmit. And a text box will open up and type in three significant things. So this is about the American economic evolution. When the country first began, and it's important to note because there are some people that believe that a global economy is bad, it's terrible, but the United States is only here because of a global economy. The colonists originally set out for the New World mostly for economic reasons, and they were able to harvest natural resources and send them back to England in particular to make manufactured goods. So when our country first began in the colonial stage and also the early republic, we were exporting mostly natural resources, especially that of an agrarian nature. So we were mostly agricultural based country. Most of our population was agriculture, and very few people lived in cities. Which, by the way, if I could just pause to say, one of the arguments made in favor of the electoral college is it's to protect rural areas, which is false because, like I said, most people lived in rural areas. It never would have even come across the founders' mind that it was necessary to do otherwise. But anyway, they also, because of this nature, had to import manufactured goods, and they did attempt to foster infant industries, young industries with basic manufacturing, which was extremely limited with tariffs. So tariffs would be used on imports to benefit that. And of course, that would create a political issue because the South was even more agricultural than the North, and they would resent the introduction of tariffs to begin with. But they didn't really need a lot of government revenue, and so tariffs were enough because remember, at the time, the government was incredibly small. Then we ended up, by the end of the Civil War, engaging in a heavy system of industrialization. The Industrial Revolution, of which here there's only one. In Europe, there's actually two. This would be the second one for them. But the Industrial Revolution would see the expansion of manufacturing, especially in the North, a little bit in the South, but mostly in the North, especially along the East Coast. This would lead to rapid expansion in the economy. And remember, when this all first started, there was little or no regulation to slow it down. So no pollution laws, no safety laws, no child labor laws. Take that 3-year-old and send him into that machine to clean it out. So this kind of stuff happened, and it meant that there could be explosive growth. But of course, whenever you have that kind of growth and it's untested and unstable, it also means that you end up with panics, or they called them depressions back then, when the economy contracted severely. And so you had periods of boom followed by shorter periods of bust, and then it would go back to booming again where the economy would expand. There was, of course, a need for labor, so it was incredibly advantageous for the country to have an extremely liberal immigration policy, allowing people to come in from Southern and Eastern Europe in particular. And then, of course, the government's approach was known today as classical economics, the following of Adam Smith's teachings, basically that the government take a laissez-faire approach, hands-off, limited intervention, with the exception of tariffs, of course. And that meant that the economy could kind of just chug along on its own. Then we enter a fourth period where we see the last big, great boom without any concern for the consequences, and that would be the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties is an incredible example of limited government intervention. Calvin Coolidge, one of the Republican presidents during the period, said that American business is big business. So he was trying to put off some of the previous concerns during the Progressive era about monopolies and trusts. And they allowed for incredible expansion of economic wealth and productivity and manufacturing during the 1920s. And it was a huge success. And the country did grow by leaps and bounds during that decade and incurred an enormous amount of wealth. However, the untold picture was that that wealth wasn't necessarily shared. And so 40% of the country lived under the poverty line. And many people, of course, started to borrow. And this would set up the situation that eventually led to the Great Depression. Once the Great Depression happened, from an economics point of view, and especially when it comes to government involvement, a man by the name of Keynes, which is spelled Keynes, would develop a theory basically saying that the government couldn't stand back and do nothing. It eventually had to intervene, and he proposed two different methods for doing that. One is by spending, because the government is the biggest consumer, and the other way was by lowering interest rates, because if banks lowered interest rates, then people would be more willing to take out loans and purchase, and businesses would expand, and so on. And so government started to pick up on these policies, and even though he didn't write it till about halfway through the 1930s, eventually it would be followed by most advanced industrial democracies until today, with some modifications, of course. Also, at this time, it was seen that without any type of regulation, the economy could be ruinous to some people, and so labor laws were introduced, for instance, limitations on the work week, overtime pay, minimum wage, all those types of introductions. Eventually, this was expanded to include things like pollution laws, for instance, that would grow throughout up until the 1970s. And to pay for many of the programs that were incurred during the Great Depression, we would rely more and more on a progressive tax system that sees the percentage of the tax increase along with your wealth. This would go on for a few decades, from 1930s up through the 1970s. By this point, there would be some calls to scale some of that back, to decrease the growth of regulation and government spending, and to put more back into the hands of producers in particular. Two economists of name that would be important during this time would be Milton Friedman, who believed that, once again, taxes need to be lowered, regulations need to be decreased. And he also believed that the central bank, which in our case is the Federal Reserve, should help control inflation as much as possible. A counterpart of his would be Art Laffer, and we'll talk more about him tomorrow. But he will basically say that the taxes is the main object that the government should be concerned about. Too high taxes, he argued, could lead toward less productivity, people wanting to work less, companies wanting to make less, and so on. And so he actually argued that if your tax rate is too high, you actually won't bring in as much tax revenue, because if people avoided working, then there wouldn't be as much taxed, and even at a higher percentage, you would bring in less. And this all became boiled down to what we refer to as supply-side economics, policies that favor the producers in particular, so that way they can expand and hire more people. With less taxes and less regulation, businesses would be willing to do this. Of course, this continues the debate until today. How much should the government be involved? Should it take more of the Keynesian approach, which is to have the government be more of an actor to prevent or at least modify contractions that happen? Or should they get out of the way and have a decreased sense of involvement like Art Laffer and Milton Friedman advocated in the 1970s and 1980s? Art Laffer, by the way, is still alive at this point. Does anybody have any questions about any of that? Anything at all? All right. So don't forget to put in your 3 points and submit.